Welcome, guys. This is Stalking Synchronicity. You're gonna have to close your mic. Yep. Cool. This is Stalking Synchronicity, a lecture series in 3 parts. Before we begin the discussion, allow me to offer you some useful rules of thumb for exploring this territory, to give you a sense for some of the ideas that you might want or need. Use them only if they prove useful to you. I wish you luck on this journey, and I want you all to know that I believe in you, and that you should believe in you too. These are my top 10 tips for stalking synchronicity. Number 1. Everything is a metaphor. Number 2. Everything is connected. Number 3. Always look for the lesson. Number 4. As above, so below. Number 5. Language is magic, is transformation. Number 6. If it doesn't ring like a bell for everyone, it's not quite right. Number 7. If you want to hear the music, you need to make less noise. Number 8. Pay attention to the omens, the repeating themes in life. Number 9. Around any resonant dialogue on synchronicity, the signs will precipitate. And number 10. All things are possible to one who is willing to believe. For a more thorough explanation of each rule, please refer to Appendix 1 in the lecture notes. Please note, if you are to follow these rules, you must believe in the possibility of their truth. If you do not, then they will never be real to you. The Tinkerbell principle is worth meditating on if you wish to succeed. And remember, always to wander this wide world of ours, and never to cease to wonder at the harmony of its song, or from whence it springs. For the eternal spring is the soul of the world, and there you will find yourself, reflected in the waters. What is synchronicity? Synchronicity, Psynchronicity, alternatively spelled Synchr, by the man who coined the term, Carl Jung, is the concept or phenomenon of meaningful coincidence or acausal parallelism. This can be conceptualized as being in opposition to mere coincidence, which is the concept of an apparently meaningful, deceptively so due to a variety of cognitive biases and methodological errors, yet statistically insignificant co-occurrence of two or more causally disconnected phenomena as a simple consequence of the laws of probability theory, in particular the law of truly large numbers. In contrast, synchronicity is proposed to be a kind of meaningful synchronization between two or more causally unrelated contexts by virtue of some acausal connective principle which is responsible for bringing the course of events in various contexts into a parallel alignment with some psychic state or content. I spell this word with the PSY prefix to denote the relationship between synchronicity, psychology, and psychic phenomena. However, the prefix that Jung picked is significant also, in that it emphasizes the nature of the synchronistic experience, which relates to the coming together of many things, which is to say the alignment or synchronization of various factors to produce a window of opportunity for growth and for new experience. When I first came across synchronicity, I described it to myself in a fashion similar to the way Jung characterizes examples he offers, although I had never read Jung myself at the time. Jung says, "When coincidences pile up in this way, one cannot help being impressed by them. For the greater the number of terms in such a series, or the more unusual its character, the more improbable it becomes. My version of it was like so. First, let us say that you experience one coincidence, a mere coincidence, that catches your attention somehow. Then, let us say that what you might see, if you were astute and attentive to the subtleties of the matter as you peered intently at the first coincidence, was a second coincidence, which was, in some strange way, connected to the first, yet you knew it could not be. So, a coincidence of coincidences, so to speak, in that we have now a pair of coincidences between which can be perceived a kind of parallelism or meaningful connection, for which a causal explanation appears to be, in every conceivable way, utterly impossible. Then let us imagine that upon witnessing such a state of affairs and experiencing renewed interest in relation to this phenomena, that it might be possible to perceive a certain alignment between the two coincidences which is induced through an association between some subjective state of affairs and a message or sign which has constellated recently in the individual's experience that impels them to act on the coincidences. A decision that then crystallizes an opportunity to play out the repeating theme which is the parallel. And because it has recently constellated in the individual as something meaningful, as some sign, they therefore perceive in the opportunity a chance to learn about themselves and to achieve growth. So here we see we have three of a kind, and when we have three or more of this kind, we begin to approach a kind of statistical impossibility, wherein the probability of any one of the events individually is low, to be sure, but the coalescence of them all brings about a new dimension almost in how improbable this falling together in time really is. Or, at least, the skeptic must grant me this: it certainly does seem strange. Such an impression is only strengthened when we begin to notice that these coincidences can and often do occur between contexts which, according to the classically scientific view of reality, cannot be causally connected. Such as, for instance, the alignment of certain events with your own internal machinations, such that an opportunity presents itself to you at just the right time, which would not have been possible were it not for X and Y. Material determinants, such as losing your job due to poor performance at work and too many sick days, for instance, yet would have been just as impossible without A and B. Psychological determinants which were contingent on some experience you would not normally have exposed yourself to, yet were exposed to on the most recent day that you failed to attend work after having slept through your alarm, thinking that you would just be taking a sick day. Thinking, that is, that what you were doing was insignificant. This piece of novelty, which normally you would not have been exposed to because part of your experience by chance, this piece of novelty, which normally you would not have been exposed to, became part of your experience by chance because you happened to sleep through your alarm and was undertaken on a whim, an intuition from a vague omen, a message from a dream, or a lesson learned recently. This experience had some kind of impact on you. It affected your attitude in the coming days and weeks. Perhaps your goals or your dreams shifted like the sands, and this attitude shift contributed to losing your job. Yet, just as the constellation of events leads to the termination of your current role, an opportunity manifests as an extension of the original experience. An opportunity which reflects the shift in your attitude somehow. So, if we can observe and thus must suppose that there is some type of strange parallelism between the realization of the pairs A and B with X and Y, we would be forced to consider that there might be some kind of a-causal relationship between the two pairs, because such an alignment seems more than merely improbable, even taking the law of truly large numbers into account. There are many ways to communicate the notion of synchronicity, and each individual experiences the phenomenology of synchronicity in accordance with the native language of their own personal cognitive architecture. So there are certain barriers to communicating some of the features of the experience. However, it is possible to get a general sense of what is meant by the idea, first by reviewing the definitions, metaphorical and technical, that I provide here in this lecture, and second, by attempting to discern from the accounts given by others the qualities and regularities of the experience which are common between contexts and among individuals. This means that, in order to effectively generate a model of this territory, you will need to learn to notice the parallel threads that connect all things together, and you will need to study the recursively resonant nature of these parallels. As a final note on the nature of synchronicity, I will say this. The music of reality is a transcendental symphony the likes of which we have never known. It is a beautifully immaculate mystery of such profound depth that we have always only ever just begun to scratch the surface of its arcane secrets. The world that we experience is filtered and construed by the framework we project onto it, and we perceive only that which we have developed the faculty for. All else is lost upon us, and we are blind to it, keen as our vision may be. The proposition is simply this. There is an octave of order in nature which exists and is manifest above what you are capable of perceiving, and this is what is meant by synchronicity. Furthermore, I believe that it is possible not only to develop the faculty for perceiving this higher octave of order, but to train yourself to track it and to touch it. What does it mean to stalk synchronicity? I should clarify that my knowledge of this material, this territory, was not derived from Carl Jung, but is in truth the product of my own investigations, subsequent to guidance provided to me by my mentor, a man I will refer to as Mystic. My mentor taught me a great many things that he no doubt learnt through his own personal investigations, parallel to his dedication to reading, with an emphasis on such subjects as history, philosophy, psychology, and the paranormal or the occult. Much of the material that I explore with you in this lecture today and in this lecture series more generally is derived from my investigations of the subjects about which he taught me, as my curiosity into his compendium of ideas, as it were, led me to insist upon my own exploration of the territory. Who can believe stories such as these, after all? It was only through the active investigation in my own life that I was able to come to terms with the reality of synchronicity and synchronistic phenomena, because it was not until I had all the evidence in front of me that I could see with what I truly needed to reckon in order to resolve this mystery I had begun to decipher. The mystery, of course, being, what, at any rate, was he even talking about? Why did he find this so compelling, so undeniably real? How could I take a look for myself at what he had uncovered, and what did I really think of it? When I reference Jung, it is not because I am referencing the ideas of my teacher, because the man who taught me did not teach me Jung's ideas. He taught me his own, some of which were Jungian in nature, which is to say, of the Jungian school of thought. However, he did not teach me to believe what Jung believed about synchronicity. He taught me what Jung had said, and he recounted to me his own experiences, as well as many stories he had heard told by others and found written in books, and together he and I discussed the phenomenal qualities associated with those stories, and how one could cultivate such qualities in their own experiences of the world. Despite the fact that my education did not come directly from reading Jung, this was a secondary resource that I utilized during my time working with Mystic, not a primary source of my learning. Much of the material that Mystic taught me about was, directly or otherwise, associated with the Jungian methods of analytical psychology and by extension the Jungian techniques of dream interpretation, while also being intricately related to the Jungian idea of synchronicity, though he claimed to have traced this specific concept back through the annals of history to ancient Sumeria, and I would dare say, from the evidence that he presented to me at least, that he was right. During the course of my work with him, there were a few subjects upon which we focused, which are now consequently the focus of this series of lectures. Chiefly among them, and therefore warranting a special mention, is the study of alchemy, knowledge of which is both inherent within and crucial for the developmental pattern that humanity tends to inhabit. In addition to alchemy, this lecture series will, in its attempt to account for the territory being discussed most fully, cover such topics as the signal noise problem, psychic integration, shadow work, elemental mastery, and the magic of language. Each lecture will address a key area of the analytical framework I have developed in order to map the synchronistic territory, and will elaborate upon the corresponding, or broad strokes, methodological approach that I recommend for anyone who wishes to explore this phenomenon for themselves. These are the ideas upon which I expound in this lecture today, and upon which I will expand in the future lectures in this series. Including this lecture, there will be 10 in the series. It is undeniably true that Jung knew of and about synchronicity broadly, and that he studied it in depth during his life and in the course of his work. Therefore, it is sensible to assume that he had a good sense for the phenomena, and that he may know of curious examples with which we might grapple. We would do well to heed his words. However, mystics spent a lifetime practicing chiefly one skill, a skill which Jung neglected to some degree: how to cultivate the synchronistic experience and how to amplify it. This, my mentor called Stalking Synchronicity, and that too is how I refer to these ideas, and to this art, as I find the metaphor apt. It is very much like stalking a wild animal, wily and sly. Now let's talk about some common definitions of synchronicity. Here I will provide several definitions Jung outlined, then one of my own which I find a touch more helpful for the cultivation of openness and awareness in relation to the idea being described. Jung writes, "How are we to recognize acausal combinations of events, since it is obviously impossible to examine all chance happenings for their causality? The answer to this is that acausal events may be expected most readily where, on closer reflection, a causal connection appears to be inconceivable. For wherever a cause is even remotely thinkable, synchronicity becomes an exceedingly doubtful proposition. It is impossible with our present resources to explain ESP or the fact of meaningful coincidence as a phenomenon of energy. This makes an end of the causal explanation as well, for effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore, it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but of a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation. Here I would like to call attention to a possible misunderstanding which may be occasioned by the term synchronicity. I chose this term because the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningfully but not causally connected events seemed to me to be an essential criterion. I am therefore using the general concept of synchronicity in the special sense of a coincidence in time of two or more causally unrelated events which have the same or similar meaning, in contrast to synchronism, which simply means the simultaneous occurrence of two events. Synchronicity therefore means the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state, and in certain cases, vice versa. The occurrence of a meaningful coincidence in time can take three forms. A. The coincidence of a certain psychic content with a corresponding objective process which is perceived to take place simultaneously. B. The coincidence of a subjective psychic state with a phantasm, a dream or a vision, which later turns out to be a more or less faithful reflection of a synchronistic objective event that took place more or less simultaneously, but at a distance. C. The same, except that the event perceived takes place in the future and is represented in the present only by a phantasm that corresponds to it. Another way, which is more useful in my opinion, in which one can think about synchronicity and synchronistic phenomena is as a sort of resonance chamber, a kind of harmonic amplification zone, if you will. This resonance chamber is manifest from the recursive feedback loop which exists between the interpretation one projects onto the world and the phenomenological perceptions of that world that they then experience. Specifically, it begins to occur when two or more people are able to maintain a resonant, authentic connection and elevate one another continually through a progressive developmental dialogue that includes all of the facts of experience. Synchronicity is a phenomenon which is extraordinarily difficult to discover without a genuine willingness to have an open discussion about it, because the phenomenon is precipitated in one's reality through a cultivation of awareness in relation to it. The very content of the dialogue one has about synchronicity will often appear in other contexts for both participants, spawning new parallels for each to follow and later discuss further. In this way, the level of resonance in the chamber slowly builds, and as it does so, it becomes more and more apparent. However, one must note that if their reaction to this quality of resonance is to put padding on the walls, so to speak, which is an unconscious compulsion to rationalize the anomalous facts away, then it will be unsurprising when dialogues with them fail to contain that quality. One cannot find something that one will not look for. Thus, one way that you can approach this discussion if you have never experienced anything like what is being described before is simply this. Listen to the stories other people tell. In this resonance chamber we are creating together right now, merely by participating in the discussion. And ask yourself if you have ever experienced anything like that which is being spoken about before, and how you might go about seeking out such an experience if you have not. If you ask clear, honest questions and listen with curiosity to the answers given, you will find what it is that you are looking for, and you will, in the fullness of time, make up your own mind about it, as we all always do. Now that we have outlined some definitions, let us examine some notable examples of synchronicity, upon which one ought to meditate if one truly seeks to understand this material and really wishes to cast conscious light upon it. Note, most of these examples are provided by Jung, though several are from Mystic and myself, and one or two originate from other historical persons. These are not intended to evidence the phenomenon, merely elaborate on it. Jung writes, my example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day, with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabaeid beetle, or common rose-shaped fur, Satonia aurata, whose gold-green colour most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. I must admit that nothing like it ever happened to me before or since, and that the dream of the patient has remained unique in my experience. I should like to mention another case that is typical of a certain category of events. The wife of one of my patients, a man in his 50s, once told me in conversation that, at the deaths of her mother and grandmother, a number of birds gathered outside the windows of the death chamber. I had heard similar stories from other people before. When her husband's treatment was nearing its end, his neurosis having been cleared up, he developed some apparently quite innocuous symptoms, which seemed to me, however, to be those of heart disease. I sent him along to a specialist who, after examining him, told me in writing that he could find no cause for anxiety. On the way back from this consultation, with the medical report in his pocket, my patient collapsed in the street. As he was brought home dying, his wife was already in a great state of anxiety because, soon after her husband had gone to the doctor, a whole flock of birds alighted on their house. She naturally remembered the previous incidents that had happened at the death of her own relatives and feared the worst. Although I was personally acquainted with the people concerned and know very well that the facts here reported are true, I do not imagine for a moment that this will induce anybody who is determined to regard such things as pure chance to change his mind. My sole object in relating these two incidents is simply to give some indication of how meaningful coincidences usually present themselves in practical life. The meaningful connection is obvious enough in the first case in view of the approximate identity of the chief objects, the scarab and the beetle. But in the second case, the death and the flock of birds seem to be incommensurable with one another. If one considers, however, that in the Babylonian Hades the souls wore a feather dress, and that in ancient Egypt the ba or soul was thought of as a bird, it is not too far-fetched to suppose that there may be some archetypal symbolism at work. Had such an incident occurred in a dream, that interpretation would be justified by the comparative psychological material. There also seems to be an archetypal foundation to the first case. It was an extraordinarily difficult case to treat, and up to the time of the dream little or no progress had been made. I should explain that the main reason for this was my patient's animus, which was steeped in Cartesian philosophy and clung so rigidly to its own idea of reality that the efforts of 3 doctors, I was the third, had not been able to weaken it. Evidently something quite irrational was needed which was beyond my powers to produce. The dream alone was enough to disturb ever so slightly the rationalistic attitude of my patient. But when the scarab came flying in through the window in actual fact, her natural being could burst through the armor of her animus possession, and the process of transformation could at last begin to move. Any essential change of attitude signifies a psychic renewal, which is usually accompanied by symbols of rebirth in the patient's dreams and fantasies. The scarab is a classic example of a rebirth symbol. In view of this complicated situation, it may be worthwhile to recapitulate the argument discussed above, and this can best be done with the aid of our examples. In Ryan's experiment, I made the assumption that, owing to the tense expectation or emotional state of the subject, an already existing, correct but unconscious image of the result enables his conscious mind to score a more than chance number of hits. The scarab dream is a conscious representation arising from an unconscious, already existing image of the situation that will occur on the following day, i.e., the recounting of the dream and the appearance of the rose chauffeur. The wife of the patient who died had an unconscious knowledge of the impending death. The flock of birds evoked the corresponding memory images and consequently her fear. In all these cases and others like them, there seems to be an a priori, causally inexplicable knowledge of a situation which at the time is unknowable. Synchronicity therefore consists of two factors. First, an unconscious image comes into consciousness either directly, i.e. literally, or indirectly, symbolized or suggested, in the form of a dream, idea, or premonition. And second, an objective situation coincides with this content. The one is as puzzling as the other. How does the unconscious image arise, and how the coincidence? I understand only too well why people prefer to doubt the reality of these things. Now, the more the foreseen details of an event pile up, the more definite is the impression of an existing foreknowledge, and the more improbable does chance become. I remember the story of a student friend whose father had promised him a trip to Spain if he passed his final examination satisfactorily. My friend thereupon dreamed that he was walking through a Spanish city. The street led to a square where there was a Gothic cathedral. He then turned right around a corner into another street. There he was met by an elegant carriage drawn by two cream-colored horses. Then he woke up. He told us about the dream as we were sitting around a table drinking beer. Shortly afterward, having successfully passed his examinations, he went to Spain, and there, in one of the streets, he recognized the city of his dream. He found the square and the cathedral, which exactly corresponded to the dream image. He wanted to go straight to the cathedral, but then he remembered that in the dream he had turned right at the corner into another street. He was curious to find out whether his dream would be corroborated further. Hardly had he turned the corner when he saw in reality the carriage with the two cream-colored horses. The French writer Émile Deschamps claims in his memoirs that in 1805 he was treated to some plum pudding by a stranger named Monsieur de Fontgibu. 10 years later, the writer encountered plum pudding on the menu of a Paris restaurant and wanted to order some, but the waiter told him that the last dish had already been served to another customer, who turned out to be de Fontgibu. Many years later, in 1832, Deschamps was at a dinner and once again ordered plum pudding. He recalled the earlier incident and told his friends that only de Fontgibu was missing to make the setting complete. And in the same instant, the now senile de Fontgibu entered the room, having got the wrong address. Now, I wish to briefly comment on this example in order to emphasize the element of the story which is the last thing mentioned. For until this moment, this series of coincidences, however unbelievable they may seem, appear to fall within the bounds of rational expectations. Yet, with the addition of the detail that de Fontgibu is not only now senile, but has made a mistake in relation to the address, which is to say that he was not meant to be there, so to speak, elevates the improbability of this incident in an astronomical way. It truly beggars belief to suggest that the last detail can quietly be added to the pile as if it were merely one more in the series. Jung writes, thus he relates that, while writing his book on the atmosphere, he was just at the chapter on wind force when a sudden gust of wind swept all his papers off the table and blew them out the window. This example reminds me of a pair of examples recounted to me by a mystic during our work together, which I will attempt to reproduce here as reliably as I can, followed by my own story in relation to this particular theme. The first story was the immediate association in my mind from the above quote, but it has a similar theme to the second and third stories both. Mystic told me that he did an experiment at one point, when he was living in a studio apartment which involved a bed on a platform and thus elevated off the floor and on a level distinct from the other objects in his apartment. He said that the experiment involved putting a certain pot plant up on the platform with him, so that while he slept he would be on the same level as the plant, in order to see if he could develop any kind of psychic connection with the plant. A strange experiment, to be sure, but he was sometimes a strange man, though no less brilliant because of it, and oftentimes more so, in fact. Regardless, as the story went, one night he was asleep and during a dream he suddenly had the most powerful impression or intuition that he ought to wake up because the plant was in danger and needed his help. This he did, but when he awoke nothing was amiss and the plant was standing just where it always was, unharmed. Moments later, a gust of wind blew through his open window and unbalanced the plant, threatening to knock it over and off the platform, but for the fact that Mystic had awoken, for he reached out and caught it, preventing it from falling and thus being harmed. Now, I'm not asking you to make anything in particular of this story, as I myself found it very difficult to believe. However, there it is. That is what he told me, and I did not know him to be an intellectually dishonest man. The second story concerns the same theme. However, it is a more direct type of event, and consequently it sounds much more ridiculous when you hear it. This story, you will think, simply must be false, because such a thing cannot happen in the reality you inhabit. If it could, you would know. Right? I thought so too, and I found this story absurd to say the least. Curious, so very curious, but clearly impossible. Right? Well, listen to this. The setting of the story, from memory, is that he was experiencing a breakup with a woman he was involved with, and was thus in an elevated emotional state. His internal weather was chaotic, one might say. It went like this. As he came to his door and laid eyes on a woman on a bicycle riding up his road, the weather suddenly shifted as his mood shifted too. The one moment it was storming and raining, and the next it was snowing, beautiful, white and pure. This woman would then stop to speak to him for some reason, and they would strike up a conversation which had resonant connections for the both of them. There were many curious details in the story, such as the fact that he had a dream involving her and lice that night, only to wake up to find that he had caught them. This in itself is of course barely worth mentioning, except that he said she later went on to study lice in a professional capacity, which is curious indeed. However, what I found most curious was the notion that it was possible for a particularly resonant psychic state to effect an immediate and instantaneous transformation in the localized weather patterns, such that they mirror the internal weather of the resonant individual. This I found particularly hard to believe, yet intriguing nonetheless. I resolved to doubt it, but investigate it anyway. The third and final story is my own account of exploring this idea. For many months, I simply assumed that this was impossible and didn't bother investigating it seriously. However, because the storm archetype is central to my cognitive architecture, I would periodically consider the question, if and how it could be possible, and vaguely I would consider what it might take to test the idea, but I never pursued it. Then, one day, I was having a particularly resonant dialogue with a lovely lady who I was teaching this exact material, which is to say, how to stalk synchronicity, and during the course of the dialogue, I asked her if she thought it could be possible for the internal weather of an individual who was experiencing a particularly resonant psychic state to trigger a corresponding shift in the localized weather pattern, and we discussed the potential dynamics of such a situation before we agreed that it seemed quite unlikely. Not more than 20 minutes later, she quietly informed me that a storm had started very suddenly in her vicinity, and within half an hour it had very suddenly stopped again. This, the abrupt beginning and end, was not normal for her area, she told me, and I remarked upon the peculiarity more broadly of the coincidence between my question in the dialogue and the event at her location. Of course, we both ultimately agreed that it was a coincidence. A spooky one, to be sure, but one nonetheless, and I maintained this view. Until I experienced it again, 2 more times within the next 2 weeks. On both occasions, an invocation of the storm idea was correlated with the sudden onset of chaotic weather, and on one of the occasions the weather appeared to parallel my internal emotive state of affairs, shifting in sync with them. I could continue to furnish you with details of this particular theme, which is very resonant in my phenomenology and recurs in very strange ways for me, but it would be simpler to move on to more general terms. Jung writes, "When coincidences pile up in this way, one cannot help being impressed by them. For the greater the number of terms in such a series, or the more unusual its character, the more improbable it becomes." You might ask, how can I prove it to you? What evidence can I show you of its existence? One of the things that happened during my own journey exploring this territory was that the man who taught me about this material described to me, in one of our earliest conversations on the matter, how he approached it when he was younger, when he first came across these ideas. This dialogue is linked in the appendix, where you can listen to him talk about this content. Initially, he thought that when his friends and he were talking about psi phenomena and about synchronicity, that it was just a waste of time, that they were talking about nothing. So that intrigued me because I thought that this was the correct attitude, and I was curious how he could have transitioned from that point of view to the one he had now, given that all my discussions with him thus far had proved him to be extremely well educated and remarkably articulate, with a coherent and rigid epistemology. But the topic he was talking about was something I regarded as ridiculous and likely delusional: the inability of another to think critically. This was a little bit of a dissonance in my mind. So sparkling was his intelligence, yet I was to suppose that he had simply confused himself into these elaborate ideas about reality that had no basis in any facts, experiential or otherwise. So what I then thought to myself was that I would listen to him talk about this and listen to his stories, but I would not believe him. In fact, for most of the time when I was listening to him speak, I explicitly disbelieved him. Not as a person, just that it could be possible, that his stories could be true or real, because some of them were so fantastical, so beyond anything I have ever experienced. I too thought it was probably a waste of time to talk about these things, but I was willing to listen and explore, and as I listened, I noticed he didn't describe to me a way that I should come to believe what he did, but merely a path that I could walk if I wanted to see what he meant. And so, disbelieving my teacher, I walked the path he told me about, so that I could check it out, and so that I could prove to myself that the things he said must have some other explanation. It took me 6 months of telling myself there is another explanation and searching for it before I accepted that the explanation was simple. This was real, and all that remained in my mind was to explain to myself at the very least how it worked. So I do not ask you to believe me, but neither can I prove it to you. This is a part of the world that you can only ever explore yourself, and that you will have to make your own mind up about after a period of consideration which is appropriate in light of the evidence. What evidence can I show you of its existence? Nothing more than my own stories, my own experiences, my own parallels with others who I work with. My parallels with you, perhaps. I can tell you what type of evidence I have found, and what your evidence might look like, and even maybe where you might be able to look to find it, but I can never show it to you directly. Only you can achieve that feat. As an example of the kind of thinking which both considers openly the possibility of meaningful coincidences and is also critical about them, here is a passage from Jung. Listen to his careful, analytical attitude on the matter, and pay special attention to the way he accounts for cognitive biases, the way he searches diligently for a causal or rational explanation, and the way he reasons about the validity of the series as an example of synchronicity. Jung writes, chance groupings or series seem, at least to our present way of thinking, to be meaningless, and to fall as a general rule within the limits of probability. There are, however, incidents whose chancefulness seems open to doubt. To mention but one example out of many, I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday. We have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone. That same morning, I made a note of an inscription which read, Est humo totus medius piscis ab imo. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for several months, showed me some extremely impressive pictures of fish which she had painted in the meantime. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish-like sea monsters in it. On the morning of April 2nd, another patient, whom I had not seen for many years, told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this time engaged in a study of the fish symbol in history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. The suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, i.e. an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to me to have a certain numinous quality. In such circumstances, we are inclined to say that cannot be mere chance, without knowing exactly what we are saying. The strength of an impression, however, proves nothing against the fortuitous coincidence of all these fish. It is, admittedly, exceedingly odd that the fish theme recurs no less than 6 times within 24 hours. But one must remember that fish on Friday is the usual thing, and on April 1st one might very easily think of the April fish. I had at that time been working on the fish symbol for several months. Fish frequently occur as symbols of unconscious contents. So there is no possible justification for seeing this as anything but a chance grouping. Runs or series, which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences, must for the present be regarded as fortuitous. However wide their range may be, they must be ruled out as acausal connections. It is, therefore, generally assumed that all coincidences are lucky hits and do not require an acausal interpretation. This assumption can, and indeed must, be regarded as true so long as proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. As a pendant to what I have said above, I should like to mention that I wrote these lines sitting by the lake. Just as I had finished this sentence, I walked over to the sea wall and there lay a dead fish, about a foot long, apparently uninjured. No fish had been there the previous evening. Presumably it had been pulled out of the water by a bird of prey or a cat. The fish was the 7th in the series. You might ask, where should I begin if I want to find evidence of my own? Well, first and foremost, I would suggest that this lecture series is the best way for you to learn about this material, and that you engage with the content of each lecture in your own way during the period of time between each presentation, exploring the material discussed during these lectures through a series of personal investigations, followed by discussions with other people that either know about this territory or are learning about it too. The best way to approach this is to think of it as a study, something to explore, meditate on, and discuss, in a cycle that continually refines the approach you are taking to each step in the process. For this refinement, the discussion step is crucial because it allows the externalization of the framework one is using to think about the experience, and that alone can alert an individual to the shadow of their projection, that which is hidden from view or deselected from focus. Yet the key strength of the dialogical articulation of the framework is in the ability not of oneself to notice, but of the other person to participate in a sort of game of free association that brings to the surface alternative resonant threads which run thematically parallel to one another. Through this activity of free association, those individuals who are undertaking an exploration of the material encounter a relatively unique opportunity to perform a form of verification, to ask yourself, what did the other person share unexpectedly, and how did that relate to what you shared with them? Therefore, a chief resource in the study of synchronicity is to be found in the act of swapping stories, and of offering, freely and authentically, anything which occurs during this process of storytelling. In concert with this storytelling, you are encouraged to engage in a critical meta-analysis of the kinds of assumptions being made in the interpretations offered by others, and to attempt to conceive of the consequences such assumptions might have on their experiences of their experiments. This means making the discussions about the stories that are swapped self-referential in nature. Through this recursion, the analysis is refined, and thus so too is the interpretation. In the process of participating in a developmental dialogue that centers around the topic of synchronicity, what one is likely to notice is that the synchronistic qualia in question are actually precipitated around the dialogue, which is to say, appear in a temporally proximate window as signs or metaphors that reflect the very topics discussed during the dialogue. This offers a relatively simple avenue of exploration because it means that the mere activity of talking about these kinds of things should, in effect, cause them to occur, though I use that word only in lieu of a term more appropriate. Specifically, the themes which characterize your personal explorations of the material are constellated as signs or omens in synchrony with the attempt to bring the same themes to conscious light during the dialogue. This act of bringing them to light does exactly that, but in the world at large. To illustrate just what it is that I mean by the themes which characterize your explorations, allow me to share some details about my mentor's gradual immersion in this phenomenon. When he first came across these ideas, he took a very literary approach to the world and thought in terms such as omens and foreshadowing, because these themes were prevalent in the literature that he had used to educate himself and therefore influenced his analytical framework. Consequently, when he began to investigate synchronicity, it first manifested in his world through these terms most natural to his way of thinking, which were those of literature. Therefore, he experienced such things as foreshadowing and omens, and he started to believe that there was a reality to these notions which was not easily or simply reducible to their utility in communication. He began to believe, on the basis of his experience, that they might actually be real in some strange way. Something he used to say was that one has to imagine that the phenomenology they would experience might be different to the phenomenology he would experience. From this we may infer that the reality of the phenomenon is experienced in those terms one most easily relates to, which is to say via those metaphors that most resonate with the way the person experiences and conceives of their phenomenal world. Therefore, in order to find evidence of your own, all you really need to do is listen carefully to the facts of the events that are recounted, and then ask questions about what state of mind is required to experience that evidentiary stream, followed by a personal exploration of your own, which necessitates an honest attempt to interpret the qualia, because at the point of experience it is no longer just a story. It has become your reality. How does one distinguish between meaningful coincidence and mere coincidence? In the beginning, every coincidence will present itself as mere coincidence, and the honest investigator must patiently undergo a very gradual process in order to begin to recognize that there can be meaningful coincidence, because the predisposition to believe in mere coincidence corresponds to a proclivity to rationalize away the anomalies of your experience. This means that one must open themselves up to the possibility before one will be able to hold such anomalies within the mind at length. A technique that I often recommend to people when it comes to exploring this material is to conceptualize what I call an anomaly box, which is an essentially logical construction that is supposed to contain odd things that happen which don't quite make sense, and they are put in the box to be explained at a later date. The box allows you to stack up these anomalies over time, and if you are patient, then you are eventually able to organize the contents of this box into categories that show you what is undeniably true. That the exception too is part of the rule. It is merely a question of how. The key to collecting the experiences which will form the contents of this anomaly box is the willingness to be patient in relation to the phenomena you are exploring, or the willingness to leave the world unexplained, paired with the tendency to return to the experiences and explore them again in an attempt to integrate them into a logically cohesive framework. In order to reliably distinguish between meaningful coincidence and mere coincidence, as opposed to overdiagnosing either of the two, one must be willing to abstain from compulsive closure, the act of projecting upon the world an explanation that does not quite fit in order to move on to other things. One must be willing to suspend the compulsion to either explain or dismiss, and to instead become comfortable with recognizing the peculiar nature of certain coincidences, and collecting them together for later separation into categories. Mindfulness is also key, both in the collection of the evidence as well as in the process of separating these experiences into categories, which are characterized by common elements, as it is the quality which allows one to notice the resonant associations between facts and experiences that properly distinguish meaningful coincidence from mere coincidence, and to further discriminate the degree of interrelation. To be blunt, mere coincidence is the co-occurrence of events in the absence of any meaningful connection that is not also causal in nature, and to determine the difference, one must be mindful in their meditations and their explorations in relation to the matter. When the technique of mindfulness is applied in this way, what one will find is that certain details stand out to one's mind without a clear logical reason why they should, and that following such cues is the key to this art. If this really does exist, why have I never noticed it before, and why can't I see it now? Every person sees the world through their own lens, and rose-colored or not, one's lens colors one's perception. All points of view come with epistemic prejudices, and these prejudices preclude us from certain experiences and knowledge because such experiences or knowledge are devalued or not focused upon. Any framework which brings certain things into focus also precludes others from focus. Casting light upon the world requires some kind of interpretive apparatus, and no matter how brilliant your apparatus is, it casts a shadow. Certain parts of the world are cast in darkness because they are blocked from view by the very nature of your illuminatory technique. Any epistemological framework comes furnished with presuppositions, and even necessary assumptions take certain things for granted, failing to examine them sufficiently as a consequence. The effect is even more pronounced here, as the phenomenon of synchronicity is related to a recursive feedback loop that exists between the projector and the projection, which is to say, the subject and the subjective experience. This has critical implications for any examination of the phenomena involved in synchronicity, because it means that a closed-minded attitude in relation to the exploration being undertaken will necessarily yield negative results. As I have already said, one cannot find what one is unwilling to honestly search for. If one is able to open oneself up to the possibility that something could be true, then any evidentiary stream which does exist will become available to the keen and perceptive eye, while an unwillingness to look for a certain phenomena will blind even the most astute individual to its existence. The best way to increase the acuity of your vision in relation to synchronicity is by accepting that it might exist and that one ought to investigate it honestly, and proceeding to cultivate an open awareness of the exceptions and anomalies, of the strange coincidences and the inexplicable facts and phenomena of your experiences. An open mind leads to open eyes, and without open eyes can we really be surprised that, when it comes to what we are supposedly searching for, we have perceived no sign of it at all. If you begin with the epistemic prejudice that this kind of thing does not exist, then you will dismiss any evidence of its existence before you are even able to adequately recognize or comprehend it. And when others suggest that you pay attention, you will think that they are speaking nonsense about nothing, that there is nothing to see. If you begin, on the other hand, with the epistemic prejudice that you would not necessarily know on an a priori basis what could exist and what could be possible in nature, and that you should therefore do your best to investigate all possibilities, then your attitude in and of itself acts as a key to unlock the door which leads to the potential reality of certain possibilities that would otherwise have remained forever inaccessible to you. Therefore, if you imagine that something which seems to you to be impossible could in fact be possible nonetheless, and thereby apply yourself to creating a conceptual resonance which might be capable of realizing the object of your imagination, what you might well observe is just that impossibility come to life before your very eyes. Having sufficiently introduced the notion of an epistemological bias, let us now deal with the manner in which science attempts to investigate psychic and synchronistic phenomena. Science does not exactly have privileged access to the truth of reality, but rather it partakes of the efficacy of logic, as it is actually a certain type of empirical philosophy which underpins modern science. Consequently, we may look to logic as a signpost indicating the kinds of limitations which science might be inherently subject to, and the most obvious and relevant of these limitations is suggested by Gödel's incompleteness theorems. That is, more clearly, that when one attempts to evaluate the axioms upon which their system of proof or logic is built by using that system of proof, they are necessarily begging the question. Consequently, a meta-language must be constructed to effectively analyze that language. However, the same problem plagues this meta-language, necessitating a meta-meta-language, and so on. Therefore, when one is attempting to examine the assumptions upon which their system of sense-making is based, they inevitably conclude that their system makes sense. Because, of course, their system is the standard by which they evaluate sense-making. Therefore, to what other conclusion could they possibly come? Abstract as this may be, this might give you some indication of the conundrum which makes an oblique approach to understanding and exploring the phenomena in question so necessary as a measure. In the situation so described, if one's foundational axioms were somehow misguided, one would indeed have no clear way of determining this to be the case, because the subliminal recognition of the coherence in the objection would inherently manifest as a threat to the coherence and stability of one's phenomenal world. This is to say that in the face of certain phenomena which threaten to cast us into the abyss of a world in which we do not know the meaning of anything, we compulsively project closure, reducing the phenomena to some caricature of itself so that we can fit it into our model without undergoing the somewhat traumatic process of a complete paradigmatic transformation. Empirical science, like any other framework, proceeds in its investigations by virtue of a variety of assumptions, many of which have no strictly scientific basis, but are nonetheless considered valid in the scientific modus operandi. Some of these assumptions are, I suggest to you today, unfounded in such a way that they critically compromise the objectivity and reliability of the process of investigating certain topics and phenomena. As suggested earlier, an epistemological presupposition constitutes a certain kind of cognitive predisposition in relation to the way a question ought to be framed, and this can easily lead to a hasty dismissal of real evidence on the facile basis that it does not conform prototypically to one's preconception of what constitutes evidence. We can see then how it is quite easy to incorrectly suppose that one has obtained evidence that there is no evidence in favor of the proposition in question. This is believed on account of the fact that you performed an experiment wherein you determined there to be a null result. Yet we can see that it is equally plausible that the reason for the null result observed is that the manner in which the experiment was conducted was insufficient to investigate the phenomenon at hand, and therefore that the null result we perceive is in fact a kind of projective deception. A projective deception is what one encounters when the manner in which one is thinking about a problem leads them to a clear conclusion which, despite fitting precisely with one's thinking and experiences, is not a realistic representation of reality. A classic example of a projective deception would be an individual who is habitually distrustful of other people because they have a perception that other people are like This perception is substantiated by their experiences of other people doing so, but what is unknown to them is that the reason that they often have unpleasant interactions with other people is that they are distrustful by nature, and therefore project upon the other individual all sorts of assumptions about their character, which the other is only too happy to validate once they realize how one is thinking about them. Therefore, you believe you have evidence which justifies your attitude in relation to other people, when really the evidence is a consequence of the closure of your attitude with respect to the prospect that you could be wrong. Because you act as if it is true, it becomes your lived experience in reality, and eventually other people will stop trying to help you see through this illusion due to your suspicious nature. So here we can see that it is relatively simple to imagine how someone's attitude towards a problem or situation can, in effect, seal them into a repetitive cycle which seems to be inescapable, a simple consequence of the nature of things, when in reality it is a projective deception generated by the individual themselves. The attitudes of scientists can exhibit this peculiar sort of closure as well. As a scientist learns the scientific paradigm of his time, his thinking becomes constrained by the rules of that paradigm. Science deals with the provisional verification of existing theories about phenomena via the mechanism of falsification. Consequently, science deals with the systematic collection of empirical evidence which is either consistent with what we think we know or inconsistent with what we think we know. Therefore, when considering phenomena which are largely incompatible with the scientific method, science either superficially examines the material or elects not to investigate it at all. When science has been used to examine subjects such as ESP and psychic abilities, the results are far from conclusive that there is no such thing, and there are many well-attested examples of such abilities which prove to be inexplicable to modern science. Indeed, these examples, when brought up, will be written off with astonishing speed as fakery of some kind, with no further attempt to explain the anomaly. Consequently, when a particular scientist decides to investigate an area of paranormal research, it is important to consider that his presuppositions about the phenomena will play a key role in determining the care with which he attends to those variables that are necessary and sufficient for its genuine manifestation. For instance, if a scientist assumes that the mechanism of psychic powers ought to be voluntary, then all his experiments will involve expectations that any subject who claims such abilities has full dynamic control over them. Many of the strange stories of this kind that I have heard from relatively ordinary people who don't believe in such things include a crucial detail: that the information obtained by the individual through inexplicable means is somehow critical for safety or has some intense emotional significance to the individual. Furthermore, the systematic disproof of 100 individuals who claim to be psychic through their demonstration of no observable ESP abilities does not discount the possibility of a 101st man who was not in the experiment who might indeed have genuine abilities. This is to say that there are many people who are charlatans, con men, or otherwise confused and misguided into thinking they have these abilities when they don't, or perhaps that they know how to control them when they do not, and the fact that these pretenders were exposed as inauthentic examples of ESP does nothing to show that there is no truth to the matter. In short, one first must have a sense for what conditions might be required to observe the phenomena. One assumption that is integral to the scientific operation is that causality is the only meaningful type of connection between two events. Although this assumption is currently being undermined by recent discoveries in the field of quantum physics, which suggest that our classical understanding of cause and effect as a temporal progression from one forward through time to the other is limited in crucial ways which must be addressed if our scientific models are going to have any sense of cohesion going forward. Nonetheless, it is perfectly valid to state that cause and effect are two of the primary objects of scientific analysis, and that we have put a lot of emphasis on distinguishing between, for instance, correlation and causation. Here we see a distinction that is extremely relevant for the evaluation of synchronicity, as the general rule in evaluating statistical anomalies is that if a causal relation is inconceivable, the two variables are merely correlated, which is the same idea mentioned at the beginning of the lecture under the name mere coincidence. Furthermore, any layperson with a reasonable degree of statistical knowledge will bristle at the mere suggestion that events which seem to stand out as anomalous to the human mind cannot be explained simply with an appeal to the law of truly large numbers. Though such statistical principles do help to explain a great many of these cases, and though the vast majority of those remaining are accounted for through direct or indirect causal links, there remain, I contend, instances wherein the absence of a causal explanation does nothing to mitigate the sense one has of some meaningful relationship between apparently disconnected phenomena. This kind of connection is simply inconceivable in the scientific model, and it is not difficult to understand why little effort is invested into rectifying this problem. It is not perceived as a problem for the scientifically minded individual because there is no such thing for which to account. Any scientific age will have its associated set of paradigms, and that which does not fit into the paradigm of the time is regarded as unreal. When asked to consider the prospect of the existence of something which is incompatible with the scientific method, a scientist will respond that such things are fantasy which could not truly exist in reality, because the reality of the notion cannot be imagined within the limits of the world the scientist is accustomed to projecting. When confronted with experiments done by other scientists who claim to have demonstrated evidence of such things as telepathy and ESP, which by their very nature contradict the basic assumptions of the modern man of science, such a scientist will often compulsively dismiss the evidence as illegitimate, even if he knows nothing about it. He may also search out any potential factor which has been unaccounted for by the experimenter, and insist that this has compromised the experiment. Asked to perform it himself, he would sneer that he has no need to do so. He knows what he would find, and anyone who needs to perform the experiment is deluded. This admittedly hyperbolic hypothetical scientist is less hyperbolic than one might imagine. I have met and spoken with individuals who hold more or less exactly this view and manifest the described attitude on the matter, and some of them can be found regularly in the voice chats on Nameless Debates. So, any open-minded scientist who wants to explore the subject must make certain that there is no room for another to dismiss his results, that his experiments are so well designed so as to remove any variables which could be leveraged to dismiss the evidence as worthy of being included in one's model of the world. Despite this, they will likely be dismissed anyway because the intuitive implications of the projections of the modern scientist lead him to the conclusion that there is nothing of substance to be investigated, and any investigations are accordingly empty of discovery. This touches on a quite different problem, which is related to the logic involved in a laboratory experiment, and whether that logic is sensible in light of the logic of the natural world, which is quite different, in fact, to the logic of a lab. In a lab, we perform experiments which explore what we think we know. That is, whether the predictions of our theories are confirmed by the empirical observations that we collect during our experiment. It should be relatively simple to imagine from this description how there can easily be methodological errors in the course of an experiment which can confound any results gathered, such that a null result can be evidence not that the phenomena is not there to be observed, but rather that one has some flaw in the methodology utilized to detect the entity in question. For instance, if you are testing for light, the presence of the light is not in question, so if you failed to find it, you would insist on looking again, and probably assume you made some kind of error. On the other hand, if you are searching for a phenomenon which you presuppose does not exist, then an erroneous result confirming its existence would be maximally questioned and critiqued, while the opposite is also true. An erroneous result denying its existence would be minimally questioned and would never be contested. After all, if your result matches the expectations of science, why continue to investigate? To summarize, scientists investigate topics that science considers to be valid sources of knowledge about the world. And when it comes to subjects that are related to parts of the world which are incompatible with the scientific methodology itself, science is of little help, if it is any help at all. In fact, I am suggesting scientific thinking can hinder you in this territory, not because the phenomenon cannot be observed empirically, but because it concerns precisely those elements of reality which are beyond your current model of the world and which refuse to play nicely with that model. Synchronicity is particularly resonant to scientific interrogation and exceptionally elusive when one attempts to pin it down with technical language because it is related to those aspects of the world that one does not yet understand. More specifically, the signs which comprise synchronicity, as words form sentences that express ideas, the words being chosen because each of them aids in chiseling out a precise mental image of the conceptual space being designated by the set of propositions, are metaphorical expressions of the choice which has led one to a certain consequence, that metaphor being manifest as the consequence itself, such that they function as a guide towards an understanding of what one has yet failed to comprehend about themselves and the limitations they impose on their world, with the attitude they embody and the language they utilize. Given this proposition about the nature of synchronicity, namely that the phenomenon is associated with those aspects of the real world and of the self which transcend one's perceptual and linguistic framework, can it really be surprising that the scientific approach to understanding the world, which deals entirely with testing what is already well understood as an idea, rarely, if ever, touches on this magical realm of discovery? In fact, only in those instances of startling scientific and philosophical advances which transcend and indeed revolutionize the scientific paradigms of the age do we find examples of individuals who might have a sense of both sides of the coin, a sense of the value of the empirical method and the paradigms which have thus far been most effective, combined with an entirely fluid phenomenology, such that the experience of the real always supersedes the interpretive projection of what it means to be real. This investigation must be cautiously and skeptically open-minded, exploring the anomalies of experiential anecdotes through one's own experiences and maintaining a sense of coherence about the entire analysis. I am not suggesting that you abandon your scientific training and understanding, nor that you believe blindly what I propose to be true. Rather, I suggest that you take care not to allow your conception of what is possible in the world as you understand it to unduly limit your investigations of what could be possible in the world as it actually exists. Distrust what you think you know and be curious about what might be possible. If you are able to manifest genuine curiosity in relation to what might be possible beyond your understanding of possibility, you will open a gateway to a dimension of the world about which you could never otherwise have known. Therefore, the scientific element of the art of stalking synchronicity is the science of a detective. Attention paid to anomalous details and facts, and a willingness to follow the stream of facts wherever it might lead. Certainly, a crucial part of any resonant conversation is that the discussion focuses on the sequence of facts in the evidentiary stream before moving to interpretation, and that we do not dwell in the emotional impressions that were left by the events that took place, but that we deal first with the details of the event as it actually occurred. The ideal detective does not need to believe what he is hearing in order to listen well and to hear what has been said. Likewise, he knows that all the details reported in the experiences of those he questions represent contrary facts which must be reconciled by the explanation which encompasses the big picture of what is true, which is to say, what really happened in the instance in question. This model of the reality of some past event slowly evolves as it is exposed to each new detail, until it suddenly transforms into a theory which not only accounts for all the anomalous facts reported by the individuals who experienced the event, but in actual fact pivots on several of them in order to eloquently account for the nature of the anomaly as it transpired. In every case, however, this skill as a detective must be preceded by an honest curiosity, which is to say, a desire to truly understand what has occurred and what is occurring now. The present moment is a mysterious thing, and in order to manifest the detective within, you must similarly believe that in every moment there are clues to discover that form a trail of breadcrumbs which, if followed, will lead you, step by step, up and out of the cave, into the sunlight. This is a quote by Richard Dawkins. Now, I want to return to the idea of the supernatural and explain why it can never offer us a true explanation of the things we see in the world and universe around us. Indeed, to claim a supernatural explanation of something is not to explain it at all, and even worse, to rule out any possibility of its ever being explained. Why do I say that? Because anything supernatural must by definition be beyond the reach of natural explanation. It must be beyond the reach of science and the well-established, tried and tested scientific method that has been responsible for the huge advances in knowledge that we have enjoyed over the last 400 years or so. To say that something happens supernaturally is not just to say we don't understand it, but to say we will never understand it, so don't even try. Science takes exactly the opposite approach. Science thrives on its inability, so far, to explain everything and uses that as the spur to go on asking questions, creating possible models and testing them, so that we make our chain. So that we. I think I've made a typo. Fuck. I don't know what that's supposed to say. Oh, wait, no, I didn't make a typo, I just can't read. So that we make our way, inch by inch, closer to the truth. If something were to happen that went against our current understanding of reality, scientists would see that as a challenge to our present model, requiring us to abandon or at least change it. It is through such adjustments and subsequent testing that we approach closer and closer to what is true. What would you think of a detective who, baffled by a murder, was too lazy even to try to work at the problem and instead wrote the mystery off as supernatural? Sorry about that one, folks. The first thing to notice about this piece of prose, taken from Dawkins' book The Magic of Reality, is that he begins by defining the supernatural out of existence. Now, this in itself is not particularly problematic, as I myself do not believe in the supernatural per se. However, I strongly suspect that Dawkins' conception of the supernatural would include a wide variety of phenomena that I might regard as perfectly natural. In this case, he is motivated by his ideological objections to religiosity, which are the central driving force of much of his material written for the general public, an attitude inspired chiefly through his being an evolutionary biologist. He goes on to speak about what one might think of a detective who, upon being baffled by the circumstances of some murder, wrote the entire affair off as supernatural rather than making a genuine effort at understanding it. Of course, I doubt the irony would even register with him, that he might do the same for a vast array of natural phenomena which baffle the scientific modus operandi. More specifically, when it comes to the scientific investigation of psychic or paranormal phenomena, it is often the case that the anomalous data is sufficiently baffling that it elicits no attention at all from investigating scientists. They write the whole thing off as delusion or hallucination. Just as Dawkins suggests, just as Dawkins suggests, what ought we to think of a detective who, upon being faced with a situation, the explanation for which contradicts some of his basic assumptions, concludes that it is ephemeral and requires no account? After recounting a series of statistical anomalies in experiments performed on ESP by a scientist called J.B. Ryan, Jung says the following. One consistent experience in all these experiments is the fact that the number of hits scored tends to sink after the first attempt, and the results then become negative. But if, for some inner or outer reason, there is a freshening of interest on the subject's part, the score rises again. Lack of interest and boredom are negative factors. Enthusiasm, positive expectation, hope, and belief in the possibility of ESP make for good results and seem to be the real conditions which determine whether there are going to be any results at all. This passage alludes to the relationship which exists between the affective tone of the subject who is undertaking the experiment and the results obtained. It is only when one manifests true and genuine curiosity in relation to synchronicity that they begin to notice that it was right in front of their eyes all along. And similarly, it is only when one truly permits the seed of possibility, the space it requires in order to blossom into the lotus flower of entelechy, that they are then able to achieve a true impression of what might really be possible. For nature, in her grace, is on our side in every single moment in which we manage to be on our own side. This is perhaps cryptic, but what I mean is simple enough. What I mean to say is that if we are able to manifest an authentic connection with the world and establish continuity in that connection, such that we believe in our dreams and that we also believe in our ability to make them become real despite the difficulty inherent in the task, then we will find that as we rise to the occasion rises also to meet us. If we believe in it, it too believes in us. Naturally, I recognize that this is quite a foreign idea to the critical skepticism of modern man. That the world could believe in us is not a proposition which seems well-founded, or at least not in Western science. However, to return to the example given by Jung, and to my original point, it is the affect and the frame of mind of the subject that undertakes the experiment which appears to be the chief determinant in the outcome of the experiment, and it is precisely in this frame of mind that we find the reason for this effect. Such factors necessarily influence how the experience is being framed subjectively, which then has a rather peculiar impact on the empirical data collected. In the activity of asking questions, the terms we use restrict what is possible to what is conceivable in our language, and the language of the world does not subvert itself to our inferior dialects. Therefore, the reality of nature's true range of possibilities is, intentionally no less, clumsily constrained insofar as the manner in which we ask our questions is what is truly definitive of the answers which we receive in response. As a consequence of this, it should become apparent that the willingness to revise the assumptions upon which an idea, question, belief, or even an entire framework is based is an essential element of an honest investigation into the mysteries of the world, and more specifically into the synchronistic experience. In particular, it is the willingness to believe that such a thing could be possible, which is crucial to its phenomenal manifestation. To expand on this idea further, this passage from Jung's work on synchronicity elaborates upon an important virtue of the intuitive or mantic methodologies. This virtue is receptivity to the whole situation, in that through the use of an artifact such as the I Ching, one must necessarily open themselves up to an answer given to a question that they did not ask. Perhaps because they did not know how to ask it or did not possess the requisite language. Jung writes, "This grasping of the whole is obviously the aim of science as well, but it is a goal that necessarily lies very far off because science, whenever possible, proceeds experimentally and in all cases statistically. Experiment, however, consists in asking a definite question which excludes as far as possible anything disturbing and irrelevant. It makes conditions, imposes them on nature, and in this way forces her to give an answer to a question devised by man. She is prevented from answering out of the fullness of her possibilities, since these possibilities are restricted as far as is practicable. For this purpose, there is created in the laboratory a situation which is artificially restricted to the question and which compels nature to give an unequivocal answer. The workings of nature in her unrestricted wholeness are completely excluded. If we want to know what these workings are, we need a method of inquiry which imposes the fewest possible conditions, or if possible, no conditions at all, and then leaves nature to answer out of her fullness. In the laboratory experiment, the known and established procedure forms the stable factor in the statistical compilation and comparison of the results. In the intuitive or mantic experiment with the whole, on the other hand, there is no need of any question which imposes conditions and restricts the wholeness of the natural process. It is given every possible chance to express itself. In the I Ching, the coins fall just as happens to suit them. From the point of view of an observer, an unknown question is followed by a rationally unintelligible answer. Thus far, the conditions for a total reaction are positively ideal. The disadvantage, however, leaps to the eye. In contrast to the scientific experiment, one does not know what has happened. Jung also writes, the experimental method of inquiry aims at establishing regular events which can be repeated. Consequently, unique or rare events are ruled out of account. Moreover, the experiment imposes limiting conditions on nature, for its aim is to force her to give answers to questions devised by man. Every answer of nature is therefore more or less influenced by the kind of questions asked, and the result is always a hybrid product. The so-called scientific view of the world based on this can hardly be anything more than a psychologically biased partial view which misses out all those by no means unimportant aspects that cannot be grasped statistically. Jesus. But to grasp these unique or rare events at all, we seem to be dependent on equally unique and individual descriptions. This would result in a chaotic collection of curiosities, rather like those old natural history cabinets where one finds, cheek by jowl with fossils and anatomical monsters in bottles, the horn of a unicorn, a mandragora mannequin, and a dried mermaid. The descriptive sciences, and above all biology in the wider sense, are familiar with these unique specimens, and in their case only one example of an organism, no matter how unbelievable it may be, is needed to establish its existence. At any rate, numerous observers will be able to convince themselves, on the evidence of their own eyes, that such a creature does in fact exist. But where we are dealing with ephemeral events which leave no demonstrable traces behind them except fragmentary memories in people's minds, then a single witness no longer suffices, nor would several witnesses be enough to make a unique event appear absolutely credible. One has only to think of the notorious unreliability of eyewitness accounts. In these circumstances, we are faced with the necessity of finding out whether the apparently unique event is really unique in our recorded experience, or whether the same or similar events are not to be found elsewhere. Here, the consensus omnium plays a very important role psychologically, though empirically it is somewhat doubtful. For only in exceptional cases does the consensus omnium prove to be of value in establishing facts. The empiricist will not leave it out of account, but will do better not to rely on it. Absolutely unique and ephemeral events whose existence we have no means of either denying or proving can never be the object of empirical science. Rare events might very well be, provided that there was a sufficient number of reliable individual observations. The so-called possibility of such events is of no importance whatever, for the criterion of what is possible in any age is derived from that age's rationalistic assumptions. There are no absolute natural laws to whose authority one can appeal in support of one's prejudices. The most that can fairly be demanded is that the number of individual observations shall be as high as possible. If this number, statistically considered, falls within the limits of chance expectation, then it has been statistically proved that it was a question of chance. But no explanation has thereby been furnished. there has merely been an exception to the rule. When, for instance, the number of symptoms indicating a complex falls below the probable number of disturbances to be expected during the association experiment, this is no justification for assuming that no complex exists. But that did not prevent the reaction disturbances from being regarded earlier as pure chance. Here, Jung can be understood as saying that every answer given by nature is influenced by the kind of question she is asked, and more importantly, by the way the question is framed in the mind of the asker. Consequently, all answers derived are, in some sense, only as good as the question asked, and contain within them that seed of the type of thinking it took to conceive of the problem in such a way that this would be the most obvious answer. This speaks once more to the limitations which proceed from a linear scientific understanding of the world, which supposes that we now know what is real and what is not. The truth is, we do not know, and we are bewitched into thinking that we do. Synchronicity can be understood as the faculty of the psyche which serves to orient the individual even when they have become bewitched by some conscious projection, indicating from within the bounds of the enchantment that there is more to the world than meets the eye. Furthermore, when we are caught in a kind of impossible situation, wherein progression towards the goal is stymied by our lack of knowledge about what to do, often what one finds is that synchronicity manifests to unstick the self, giving one subconscious access to knowledge or a sense of direction, which defies the typically understood limits of sense perception. It is almost as if the transformation archetype calls to the individual, allowing them access to information which they have no rights to know in order to whet their appetite and make them believe, so that they will attempt to develop themselves. This is the call of that which is just barely beyond one's understanding, that mysterious force which impels one forward just as they get to the edge of what is safe, daring them to step beyond what they know into the real world. Ancient memory systems such as astrology and the tarot serve as other, perhaps more familiar examples of approaches to understanding the world and the self, which appeal to this broader conception of the world and draw on resonant associations which are not well understood, yet remain the subject of considerable consensus. Again, the merit of such systems is to bring into consciousness those elements of a situation or person that would normally evade the spotlight, which is the consciously projected curiosity of a question. Through these strange mantic systems, we are able to make contact with a wider notion of being receptive to reality, a certain kind of mystical belief that the information you most need to understand is resonating throughout your phenomenal world, and the act of consulting a system with a degree of randomness to it allows that resonance to manifest in conceptual associations which ring true for one reason or another and provide a certain cue upon which one is able to meditate. In these systems, we can see a definite decision that a practitioner need not understand precisely how the system they were employing worked, merely that it did. And in this way, we were able to construct intuitive memory systems which encoded knowledge in meaningful ways through associations we could not quite consciously justify. In fact, synchronicity is heavily associated with both the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious, which manifests itself when we are stymied by some situation or obstacle which prevents progress towards our valued goals. More specifically, synchronicity manifests precisely when we are caught in a situation where we must try to do what is, within the interpretive framework of the subject in question, simply impossible. It is in fact our unconscious or superconscious mind, depending on your preference, communicating to our conscious ego via metaphoric symbology the meaning which has thus far escaped the reach of one's ability to make sense. The signs are our invitations towards transfiguration and evolution. Consequently, they become most apparent to us when their recognition is of critical importance. The impossibility criterion is, in addition, very often the impetus for individuation and growth. Similarly, in the case of psychic phenomena, one can imagine that an organic psychic capacity latent within humans might require certain conditions in order to sustain its manifestation, which are in stark contrast to the constraints of a laboratory. Chiefly among these concerns is that the most obvious and intuitive objection to the limitations of the scientific method is that one can easily imagine a certain degree of affectivity, interest, and genuine engagement, which might be important to the manifestation of such powers, especially if the means of such things involves the sympathetic relationships between individual instances of consciousness. If we consider that simply becoming bored with the repetitive testing procedures could indeed have a negative effect on the testing procedure, we start to grasp the impact the scientific presuppositions have on experimentation. The signs of synchronicity are the consequences of the interference pattern generated by one's linguistic and interpretive framework, and consequently they emphasize and reiterate, through the use of vague metaphorical symbols and affective reactivity to certain stimuli, the consequences of both the flaws and the merits of the system. This is what we understand, in more mundane terms, consequences to literally be anyway. A negative consequence is a reflection of some error within your approach to the problem or situation, while a positive consequence is a reflection of the current adequacy of your constructs. These signs, however, speak a language which reaches beyond the language your conscious mind speaks, which leads to the conscious mind failing to grasp what is being indicated, often ad infinitum. Therefore, the signs do not really mean what they appear to mean at first impression, because if that were indeed their meaning, then one would no longer need to see that particular sign anymore. You would already know what it means, and it would by now be unconsciously interpreted. The fact that the sign repeats itself is the basic evidence that its message has yet to be fully integrated into the psyche, because the psyche is still concerned with it, and is still seeking it out and finding it, showing it, as it were, to your conscious mind. The conscious mind, much like a dog with its owner, cannot see where the unconscious points. The unconscious has to thrust the sign upon consciousness, and it must be stubborn, insisting, "No, this thing, you silly fool. We've done this all before. This thing." But the conscious mind never listens, for it does not know how. It has not yet learnt to recognize that particular sign in conscious language, and thus it knows not of which the unconscious speaks. Whatever your unconscious may show you in your dreams, it is certainly something of which you know not. Why else would you be so quick to dismiss it as meaningless, except that its meaning is so obscure to you as to be unrecognizable in your conscious language? Your conscious framework is best understood as the tip of an iceberg, poking above the water to look into the heavens above, yet part of an immensely larger whole with that same nature. The parts of the iceberg which are under the water may be hidden from the part which protrudes because of the reflection of the sunlight, but the mere fact that the depth of his immersion can change as the waves catch and toss him bespeaks his greater complexity, and it continues under the water indeterminably. Similarly, those elements of consciousness which are the lower half of the iceberg are capable of great depth and insight, and ought not to be ignored or treated blithely. This lower part of the iceberg is not part of the upper's experience, and does not even exist in the same world, nor speak the same language. Yet in thinking this way, the ego forgets that its conscious language is only the highest form of self-expression with respect to the ancient ancestral language which constitutes his biological and cultural origins, which are largely hidden in the depths of the arcane sea. This is the very purpose and point of the signs. It is the part they play in the drama of the individual life. They are our stage directions, to help us to write our lines along the same lines that life intended for us all along. These are the lines inherent in our nature. They are our natural form and our identity, of which the conscious ego is only the highest form of self-expression. The signs are the currents that move the iceberg from below, which guide it through the ocean and which operate beyond the conscious purview. This synchronicity is the consequence of the feedback loop that exists between the way you think and speak about the world you are experiencing and the experience that you have of that world. The recursion which belongs to the interference pattern being generated is the mechanism, as language itself only ever reflects what is, intentionally or otherwise. This, the underwater world of the unconscious, is the residence of Jung's primordial images, or the archetypes. This unconscious architecture is the basic precondition for the evolution of the language your consciousness uses, and therefore these archetypes are the life spring of conscious experience. One's conscious language figures into the signs in their manifestations, but only to a limited extent. When stuck, the archetypal unconscious manifests. Jung writes, meaningful coincidences, which are to be distinguished from meaningless chance groupings, therefore seem to rest on an archetypal foundation. At least all the cases in my experience, and there is a large number of them, show this characteristic. Although anyone with my experience in this field can easily recognize their archetypal character, he will find it difficult to link them up with the psychic conditions in Ryan's experiments, because the latter contain no direct evidence of any constellation of the archetype. Nor is the emotional situation the same as in my examples. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that with Ryan, the first series of experiments generally produced the best results, which then quickly fell off. But when it was possible to arouse a new interest in the essentially rather boring experiment, the results improved again. It follows from this that the emotional factor plays an important role. Affectivity, however, rests to a large degree on the instincts, whose formal aspect is the archetype. There is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases in the Ryan experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. Those apparently quite different situations have as their common characteristic an element of impossibility. The patient with the scarab found herself in an impossible situation because the treatment had got stuck and there seemed to be no way out of the impasse. In such situations, if they are serious enough, archetypal dreams are likely to occur which point out a possible line of advance one would never have thought of oneself. It is this kind of situation that constellates the archetype with greatest regularity. In certain cases, the psychotherapist therefore sees himself obliged to discover the rationally insoluble problem towards which the patient's unconscious is steering. Once this is found, the deeper layers of the unconscious, the primordial images, are activated and the transformation of the personality can get underway. In the second case, there was this half-unconscious fear and the threat of a lethal end with no possibility of an adequate recognition of the situation. In Ryan's experiment, it is the impossibility of the task that ultimately fixes the subject's attention on the processes going on inside him, and thus gives the unconscious a chance to manifest itself. The questions set by the ESP experiment have an emotional effect right from the start, since they postulate something unknowable as being potentially knowable, and in that way take the possibility of a miracle seriously into account. This, regardless of the subject's skepticism, immediately appeals to his unconscious readiness to witness a miracle, and to the hope latent in all men that such a thing may yet be possible. Primitive superstition lies just below the surface of even the most tough-minded individuals, and it is precisely those who most fight against it who are the first to succumb to its suggestive effects. When therefore a serious experiment, with all the authority of science behind it, touches this readiness, it will inevitably give rise to an emotion which either accepts or rejects it with a good deal of affectivity. At all events, an affective expectation is present in one form or another, even though it may be denied. This is an appropriate point from which to segue to the final section of this lecture prior to the conclusion. Once I've finished speaking, you are encouraged to pose any questions you may have, and I will attempt to answer them. From what has been said thus far, you should have a fair idea both of what synchronicity is and what it is not, as well as some sense for how you might like to go about investigating it for yourself. At this point in the lecture, we are going to dedicate some time to outlining some of the major objections and most commonly suggested reductionist explanations for the meaningful coincidences to which we must appeal in our study of synchronicity. Once each of these critiques of the theory or prospect of synchronicity and synchronistic phenomena has been elaborated, it will be addressed as completely as is feasible for a talk in this format. Perhaps the most common type of objection to a synchronistic story or happening takes the form of an eminently reasonable skepticism which seeks to exhaust simpler explanations before it will even entertain more complicated ones. For example, cognitive biases such as confirmation bias and selection bias represent an initially compelling alternative explanation to such things. The former bias, confirmation bias, is similar to what some might describe as wishful thinking. It is the unconscious tendency for human beings to find evidence which confirms their beliefs more memorable than evidence which refutes their beliefs, a tendency which serves to reinforce existing beliefs over time. Wishful thinking, on the other hand, would be a more or less conscious tendency to think about what is true along lines which appeal to one's wishes regarding what might be true. Selection bias refers to the human tendency to select a sample in a non-random way, even when aiming for randomness, a proclivity which can compromise how representative of reality one's observations are by skewing the statistical analysis with an improper sample. These are just two of a whole host of cognitive biases which afflict all human beings, any number of which could be responsible for an inaccurate perception of the statistical frequency of evidence for or against one's beliefs, and which could figure into an intuitive misunderstanding of the causal nexus of the world such that synchronicity or something like it is suspected even though it is not present. In other words, the human mind is capable of great confusion, and there are myriad ways for one's perception to be inaccurate. Therefore, why would one assume that there is anything more to these occurrences except the imprecise way in which we grasp evidence? It could also be said that these cognitive biases involve the projection of one's conscious framework onto the evidence, such that evidence which fits into the cognitive framework is regarded as true, while evidence which doesn't is regarded as false. In response to this type of objection, what I have to offer as a refutation is perhaps extremely unsatisfying, but it is nonetheless the answer to which I have come after a prolonged meditation on the matter. My response is this. These instincts that you have to doubt the reality of these phenomena while it is still plausible in your mind that they could be explained by simpler, already understood means, these instincts are both admirable and important, as they will be the future foundation of your conviction. What I mean by this is that you should be skeptical of such things, and in fact I invite you to maintain in your mind these notions that perhaps you are unconsciously misleading yourself in certain ways, and to leverage such doubt against the evidence presented to you. This attitude is entirely healthy, and it allows the individual to ensure that before they will admit to the reality of such phenomena, they have gone to every possible length to deny it or to explain it in another way. This is important because once you yourself have considered all these options, all these potential ways to rationalize the qualia that you have experienced, you will be able to rely on how skeptical you were about it initially for confidence in the stance you take once you admit of its reality. When someone else then says to you, well, what about confirmation bias or selection bias? You will smile and nod, just as I do, and say, yes, what about them? Does that explain it for you? I imagine that, just like me, you will reach a point where those explanations, possible though they may be, are no longer plausible in light of the evidence that you have witnessed, the experiences that you yourself have had, and the stories that you have heard from others like you. At a certain point, the mere fact that there are other ways that one might try to explain this phenomena becomes insignificant in comparison to the magnitude of what one must explain. Suddenly one is struck by the ignorance of the objection. Another common objection is that if this were really part of the world, then science would already have discovered evidence of it, and in lieu of such evidence, there is no reason to believe that there is any reality to this phenomena. This point of view is not one that requires any further deconstruction in this section, although it ought to be said, as was briefly mentioned before, that there is actually a plethora of evidence which garners little to no attention from scientists, because it is beyond the pale with respect to modern scientific consensus. One such compilation of curious evidence can be found in Colin Wilson's trilogy The Occult, especially his second book, Mysteries. This objection can be extended to one offered readily whenever a synchronistic story is recounted in the presence of a skeptic or non-believer, which is that no one can provide any proof that such a thing means anything at all, and that they would challenge you to do so. If you can't, of course, then the individual in question will smugly dismiss the whole story as a product of your colossal ignorance, entirely unaware of the irony of the whole affair. True as it may be that no one is able to prove synchronicity to you, it is entirely beside the point, as the evidence which can be obtained on the matter is not shown to you by someone else, but collected all of your own accord. Consequently, any objection raised on the grounds that one has not proven their point of view in the conversation is to be regarded as a non sequitur, as it is not germane to the point of the discussion. So I said this wrong when I was practicing. I don't know, apophenia or apophenia. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm just going to go with apophenia. Yeah, I'm going to go with that. Apophenia is the tendency to mistakenly perceive connections and meaning between unrelated things. This is perhaps the best non-synchronistic description of the synchronistic experience. However, this is an early stage of delusional thought which is readily observable in schizophrenic individuals. There is, however, a more general underlying tendency of the human mind to seek out patterns in random noise, a common example of which is called pareidolia, or pareidolia. I think pareidolia. This, naturally, strikes me as merely begging the question. For this to be an explanation, we must cede the assumption that the connections are, in fact, not there. In a schizophrenic, it is easy to establish that the connections are not a realistic extension of the facts. However, with the case of synchronicity, this is somewhat more difficult to demonstrate. Furthermore, if one is conscious of the tendency to perceive patterns in noise, then it is entirely possible for the individual to leverage this against the perception of such patterns as a reason for skepticism. Nonetheless, if those patterns are borne out in fruitful continuations which register in the minds of other mindful individuals as potentially resonant associations, it is quite difficult then to suppose that such connections could be explained by an appeal to a phenomenon such as apophenia. In each and every one of these cases, we have an appeal to an alternative explanation which would render insignificant the object of analysis supposed to be synchronicity, and each case essentially boils down to a rationalization that it is a kind of illusion. Such an account fails to hold water in my mind, especially when one remembers the first two of the top 10 tips that I shared at the beginning of the lecture, and in light of the matrix metaphor I will offer in a moment. More often than not, however, rather than attempting to mount a logical or philosophical critique of these ideas, those who find themselves unable to fathom synchronicity will resort to attempting to digress or disrupt the conversation, or, in the worst of cases, simply shut it down as not worth discussing. It is very common for these discussions to attract the ire of those who cannot create a mental space for such phenomena, and attempts to dialogue on the subject may invite the interjection of hostile parties who wish only to preserve the intellectual status quo which serves as a baseline for their conception of reality. If such an individual were to seriously consider the reality of these sorts of phenomena, they would experience a destabilization of that framework which they use for their existential orientation and the associated function of meaning creation within their reality. Certain attitudes towards reality deal with anomalous phenomena by dampening them, denying their reality, and generally coping with the threatening nature of the exceptions by refusing to admit their existence. These attitudes are typically possessed by those who are unable to tolerate the idea that other reasonable people might find such things worth discussing, as affording these ideas the status of plausible amidst of the exact chaos which they are attempting to avoid by denying them. For such individuals to attempt to admit that these notions are plausible is consequently to undermine those mechanisms by which one delimits delusion from inspiration, which seems a dangerous idea. Consequently, there is no such consideration possible, and these ideas are decried as not only absurd, but sometimes even as dangerous, and the need to interject and refute them is therefore compulsive in nature, not rational. As we come to the conclusion of the lecture for tonight, let us review what we have discussed thus far about synchronicity in summary form. Firstly, we talked about the nature of synchronicity, some common and or useful definitions of it, and we began to explore a little about what it meant to stalk it. You will notice that I place special emphasis on the resonance chamber definition throughout the lecture. However, the other definitions provided are extremely helpful guidelines which one can use to get a sense of the nature of the phenomena also. This art is called Stalking Synchronicity because that metaphor of stalking another animal is very apt in relation to this phenomenon, which manifests always as elusive signs which constellate just outside your conscious understanding and lead you on. Thus, you are always tracking the signs left behind by synchronicity, but rarely do you get to glimpse the actual synchronistic flow, a state in which the signs are directions that you can read in real time. After talking about why it's called Stalking Synchronicity, we discussed some examples of synchronistic stories in order to give you some idea of what kinds of experiences one would have to look for if they wanted to find what it is that I am speaking about. Most notable among these stories would have been the Scarab story and the Spanish Dream. Thirdly, we explored what kind of evidence there is of the claims about synchronicity and where one should begin if one wants to find evidence of their own. In this section, I explained that I'm not asking you to believe any of the stories that I'm telling you, and that they are merely supposed to act as a guide which you can use to inform yourself about the kinds of experiences others have had, and therefore to aid in your ability to imagine how you might come across such an experience yourself. We also spoke about how the active dialogue and discourse surrounding these events and strange coincidences is a crucial element of the entire art, not only because it allows one to reflect on how their reasoning sounds with some amount of objectivity, but also because this opens up the dialogue for resonant associations, as sharing these stories often results in someone else saying, "Hey, do you know what that reminds me of?" and then proceeding to tell a seemingly unrelated story or share a fact, which is nonetheless a missing puzzle piece for the first speaker, which they are then able to go off and explore. After discussing the importance of discussion in relation to the synchronistic experience, we talked about how one distinguishes meaningful coincidence from mere coincidence, where I talked about mindfulness, patience, and a reluctance to project closure on anomalous phenomena, then discussed epistemic prejudices generally, and more specifically, the epistemological prejudice inherent in modern science in relation to psi phenomena and synchronistic phenomena. This part of the lecture was focused around addressing some of the issues with the scientific modus operandi with respect to certain elusive and subtle phenomena which are in contradiction with some of the fundamental assumptions made in the practice of science. Finally, we touched on some of the major potential objections to synchronicity and made a provisional effort to address them. Everything that we have discussed has been intended to help you to flesh out your understanding of the concept and phenomenon of synchronicity so that you have some sense of what you are looking for, while each successive lecture beyond this one will deal with a certain subset of the techniques and ideas that I have developed during my extended analysis of this subject and my continuing attempts to stalk it. Now, as a final point of consideration before we end for the evening, I wish to relate to you first a piece of advice given to me by my ex-mentor in the course of our joint discourse on these matters, and second, a metaphor that I conceived toward the end of our work together during a particularly resonant dialogue in which the energetic had been amplified over the course of half a dozen hours. This metaphor clarified a gap in Jung's understanding, and indeed my ex-mentor's as well, and when I conceived of and articulated the metaphor, there was a clear acknowledgement that I had managed to crystallize the solution which had evaded words until that moment. The advice given to me was this: what you need to understand is that the central challenge of synchronicity is to develop empathy in relation to another human being. A cryptic statement, or so I thought when I first heard it, though I had an intuition that closely paralleled the proposition which was only semi-conscious at the time. I have come to understand this statement to be something quite profound, a proposition which speaks to the fact that the healing problem is a key aspect of the synchronistic experience, and that it is only when we have learned to relate to other people and consider their experiences, intuitions, and emotions as being equally as valid as our own, that we begin to gain access to the full set of information which is necessary in order to put the entire puzzle together. Until we have developed empathy for other individuals, we will forever be trapped in an echo of our own point of view, a certain kind of recursive hall of mirrors that shows us only ourselves. Even in others' faces, we will see our own likeness. It is only the empathy for the other person as an individual in their own right, which compels the compassion and patience necessary to truly understand another's experience. And it is this understanding of another's experience, this relativity on an interpersonal dimension of reality, which is crucial for the resonance chamber, which becomes possible once a small group of individuals begin to authentically relate on the topic of synchronicity and the synchronistic experience. So the advice I would offer to you in this quest of yours and of ours is this. Do not dismiss another's experiences or opinions because they are unlike yours, but instead try to understand how you could relate empathetically to them, such that each of you could offer the other something of value. The key to cultivating the resonance chamber is to relate authentically to every individual who is sharing the conceptual space during a discourse about it. One other thing I would recommend to you is that you keep what I call a synchronicity journal, where you focus on collecting all the anomalous and odd facts of your experiences and of those close to you whom you trust, together into one book which you update every time something strange happens. As you get better at following the signs, your entries will likely get longer, but it's important to keep this practice up because the retrospective analysis of this kind is incredibly helpful to an individual who is newly acclimatizing to the synchronistic experience. When one is able to refer back and read the facts, it dispels the retrospective reframing process of memory, which tends to compromise the objectivity of our memory of significant incidents. The more times we dismiss it, the more dim do the details become. This continues until you cannot even recall that it ever happened. A synchronicity journal is the perfect solution to this problem because it allows you to record and return to the bare facts, which are remarkable in and of themselves without any positive or negative exaggerations. Here is the problem in relation to which the metaphor I'm about to tell you was proposed. I'll be playing a recording of a conversation that occurred previously.
You know, we like to think about the laws of nature as being consistent as coherent, but one of our assumptions are they don't transform, they don't change. That's one of the interesting ideas he projects. And I keep that in mind as I describe this particular conundrum. So Jung tries to wrap his mind around synchronicity, right? And as he's trying to wrap his mind around synchronicity, or maybe it should be the other way around, it's Pauli, who is this quantum physicist, who's trying to wrap his mind around certain physical phenomena, trying to create a model for it. So Pauli is dealing with quantum physics, and there he's dealing with time in this very, very fragile and sensitive way, and he's also dealing with atomic physics. Yeah, so in science, this whole conundrum appears through the quantum physics framework, right? But the interesting synchronicity is Pauli is here talking to Jung, and both of them are trying to figure out how this could possibly make sense. And Jung's first move, I think it's a bad move because it again is a compulsive way to avoid the problem. It's just to regard it as a causal phenomena. But when he talks about it as being a causal, he describes it as it appearing to be causal, but not possibly causal. That's what he means by a causal. But he's great. But the problem is that there does appear to be an unexplainable causal nature to it.
Are you sure it's unexplainable though?
I don't think it's unexplainable. I think it is explainable, but
is it causal or is it acausal?
It's causal in a different framework. So
is it in the ontological sense? Is it causal or acausal?
I would say it's causal.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that just that the paradigm that Jung is thinking of the real world in, the only way you resolve the paradox is by calling it acausal. I think that's not a good resolution. If you believe that the universe is coherent, and that's always my first assumption, something truly remarkable has to happen for me to not to believe that. Nothing's ever contradicted that first principle, and I doubt anything ever will. And so then the question is to look for what's the framework? What's the logical framework that this phenomena could be happening in?
Is it?
So here's one very, very interesting. I love to follow almost like literary motifs. So when you read Jung, you'll notice he has two competing theories of the nature of synchronicity. And this is what makes it really fucking fascinating. Because I also had these two competing theories, and I went back and forth, almost like a cognitive dissonance between the two. And one of them is that synchronicity only happens in these key moments, right? These at a certain time on a certain day, everything lines up, and all around him appears that his existence is pure metaphor, and he's existing as a pure metaphorical existence in this pure metaphorical existence. And then he goes, well, it only happens in these moments. Other times it's not happening. And then he goes, this appears to be a very, like me as well, this appears to be a very doubtful framework. Like, what am I saying? That only in this moment that the whole universe line up this way, and all the other times it's not. The more likely possibility is that it's always happening. So then he goes, and other times he goes, I suspect that it may be that it's always happening, and it's only at certain times that we are capable of seeing it.
Right.
Do you see the interesting binary this creates? And I think the solution is a solution that includes both realities.
So that was the problem. Here's the metaphor that I produced as a solution to this problem. Versus a little introduction. It is truly a quandary to ask oneself how it can be possible for this higher octave of reality to be occurring in perpetuity, and yet most of humanity remains at best dimly aware of it, if at all, while the few of us who are acutely aware of the phenomenon seem to experience a kind of tidal effect, wherein we move in and out of alignment with that awareness. One has to ask, how can it be possible for one's experience of the world to reflect back this pure metaphorical quality of the pure interconnectivity of all things in such an undeniable and clear manner at certain special moments, and yet the rest of the time the world seems just as it would be any other day? In pursuit of a metaphorical model that is capable of simultaneously capturing both realities, the perpetuity of synchronicity and the rarity of it, I proposed the following. Imagine a matrix of interconnected beams of light which all reflect one another wherever they meet in the matrix. Each point of contact between two beams of light amplifies both, adding to the interconnectivity. An individual is represented as a point of light where a multitude of beams cross at the same location. The individual wields a multi-directional mirror capable of reflecting all of the intersecting beams of light at that particular location. When this reflective capacity is appropriately calibrated and aligned, not only is the individual more clearly able to perceive the interconnectivity of the matrix, but they also add their own light back into the mix, brightening the matrix and amplifying the phenomena. Yet, if their mirror is poorly aligned, they will not even be aware that the matrix exists. The matrix of light is the matrix of existence, where everything is connected. When we experience a resonant connection with someone else, that is the experience of becoming more aligned with the world through the interpersonal dynamic and the mutual harmonization of energy. That's the end of the lecture. Does anyone have any questions?
No questions, just bravo.
Mm-hmm. I'm reading, so I'll answer them in a sec. equally meaningful as the... No, they're not equally meaningful. They're much more meaningful. The whole point of the coincidences is that the meaning of the incidents doesn't linearly stack up to the meaning of the coincidence. So the answer to the first question is no, I don't agree with that. Yeah, I would call that. So the second, yeah, you're right, Ed. So the first question was, do you agree or disagree that these coincidences are as equally meaningful as the incidences that led to their paralleling? And I said I don't agree with that. That the entire point of synchronicity is that you cannot linearly stack up the meaning of the events and reach the same level of improbability. The improbability of the coincidence and how meaningful it is far exceeds the individual events stacked up. It's the fact that they all come together that makes it so remarkable. The second question was, the framework of stalking synchronicity seems to necessitate taking into account meaningful coincidences, which is limited to the subjective. What framework would you employ to understand the experience of sudden factual knowledge on subjects, people, incidences, etc., that should be beyond your ability to understand or deduce, but because it is beyond your personal experience, your existing life world at that point in time, and then in brackets, the experience is not bound to time or space. Yep. Like that's broadly speaking called precognition, like knowing something before it happens, or when you don't have a way to know it, like the knowing, that's precognition. That's like psi phenomena, which would be part of synchronicity. If it were related to a person, that you call it telepathy, you know what I mean? If it's related to an event, it would just be precognition. That kind of thing. So how is it? So you asked, how is this connected to synchronicity? Well, the answer to that is that it is with those individuals. So it's in relation to those individuals with whom we have an authentic connection, like where we could have synchronicity, where we will notice phenomenon like knowing things we shouldn't know how to, right? There's a strange thing which is like how like open other people are to it affects like whether or not it can happen with them, right? So one of the key things to note is that when you're like looking into knowing something that you have no way of knowing, right? The question is like, what in relation to whom? That's the question, because the person that's in relation to will almost always be significant, either that or whatever's going on in your life at the moment. Meaningful means not incidental, which is to say, it is significant to the individual, and it's not reducible to like, I don't know, like it is meaning no. So it's significant to the individual in a way that isn't reducible to statistical anomaly. Yeah, that's what it is.
I think you did it, man.
Thanks. No, I don't think it can be meaningful but not produce a feeling of significance. I don't know how that would work. I mean, there can be meaningful coincidences that occur that you don't register as meaningful, if that's what you're asking. Like, there can be coincidence. So, but what that would mean though is that later on in your life, you'd look back and you go, "Wow, that was actually meaningful." And in the past, I didn't register it. But like, in order for it to be meaningful, it would have to produce a feeling of significance in the individual at some point, presumably. Yeah. No, of course it was meaningful the whole time. Yeah. Like the way that it's meaningful is that it communicates something you need to know. Right? And the fact that you find it to be significant is a consequence of the fact that it's communicating something you need to know. Oh yeah, I think so, yeah. I think I misunderstood your question.
All right, so where do we start?
Where do we start? That's a good question.
How do we start this beginningless beginning?
I don't know. I think a really good way would be, I mean, that was a long talk, you know what I mean?
I set it up real nice, though, I think.
Like tomorrow or the next day or something, if people are like around, I would love to like come back to this VC and have a chat about some experiences that people have had along these lines. Because if it's just me talking, then it's kind of one dimensional. But when people, when it's a group of people sharing their own individual experiences, it's harder to be skeptical and like just shut it down.
For sure. What about even experiences of the lecture? Because like just even commenting along with emojis helped me retain some of the more pivotal messages that you embedded in it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like there's always a meta layer going on behind the scenes of whatever the spoken means of communication may be in a given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And like to reduce it down into emojis, at least semi-coherently, for the individual and then the people that are maybe telepathically or precognitively entangled, let's say. There's a lot of like kind of game theoretic strategies that present themselves, namely like if you're familiar with like game A or game B, in like a post-scarcity context, that is the I think that is one of the sweet spots of someone who's accepted synchronicity in a kind of datalogical sense, a hard determinist sense, to where they don't question it, but they could if they were put to task. Yeah, just listening along to words as they happen and then watching what's going on in your environment or taking notes or any of these, just kind of noticing of colors or the wind is blowing or not.
Definitely.
I put out the impossible task that some squirrels remove trash from my front yard just because I wanted them to. I didn't want to have to pick up the trash, so make the squirrels do it. And that impossible thing didn't happen. But all the normal natural phenomenon, all that stuff happened. Cars drove by, I noted the color, made some emoji notes, and basically fell in love with your words as they were happening, in and out of them, because there were moments where I was like in my own part of it, and then moments where you were holding essentially the like musical notation of the symphony of synchronicity, and the words were like the music, and it was like I was watching you play a song for people through a lecture, and then I was like experiencing the song of your words.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited for like uploading it because then everyone, then people who aren't even here will be able to, listen to that harmony, let's say.
The harmony, it's definitely encapsulated. I think you cast the paragon perfectly.
So just to quickly address Hyde's question, you asked, is the meaningful message conveyed by the synchronicity necessarily apprehended by the subconscious at the point of contact? I don't know how to answer that because I don't really know where the message is coming from, mate. The message might well be coming from the subconscious. I really can't figure it out where it comes from.
It's
Like,
presumably from either the subconscious or the conscious mind for the individual.
so like, so there's an element of it which seems like it's coming from the universe, right? And then
Yeah.
which is like sort of like implied in Height's question, right? And then there's an element of it which definitely does seem to be mediated by the subconscious mind. And then there's an element of it which is related to the conscious mind. But overall, it seems to be like more like an so it's like overlapping fields, and then they've it's like an interference pattern between overlapping fields. That's the best way I can describe it.
That is the best way, I think. The interference pattern that happens from the ripples of each other's presence, even in the environment. Like the environment is an ocean, and then each individual is casting waves by their movements. And they're like cognitive movements as well as like wishful thinking movements and all that kind of thing.
Like when like your movements generate waves, right? Then those waves, like the consequences of your movements, come back and hit you. Those ripples hit you, and those ripples mean something about how you've moved. That's synchronicity. The synchronicity is that feedback from the world.
That interplay between the two.
Yeah, exactly. It's when you interact with the world and those ripples come out from you, then the world sends ripples back. When those ripples from the world hit you, that's synchronicity.
Yep.